Welcome back, everyone. I was a little bit unsure what the best way to cover this article on informed consent was because I can't cover it in extremely rigorous detail without giving away the answers to the assignment you have, where you've got some argumentative passages, and I want you to try to figure out what the conclusion of those passages is supposed to be and outline the premises that lead to that conclusion. But I also don't want you to go into that assignment totally blind. So I'm going to provide a very short overview here. This handout is already up on Carmen, and then after I go over that, I'm going to actually run through kind of the process for pulling out premises and conclusions from this reading with some different passages, with passages other than the ones that you will be engaging with in your assignment. The other thing I'll point out about this article is that I have uploaded a version of it that contains kind of my markup. Like, it's basically an example of how I read and engage with philosophical articles. So it includes some underlining, some notes in the margins, some things that have been starred, that kind of stuff. You don't have to use the same system I do, but I wanted to give you an example of kind of what active reading looks like, because some of the stuff we're going to read over the course of the semester is kind of dense, and you've got to be able to make sense of it if you're going to do well in the course moving forward. So, what is this article about? Well, at its core, it's about the concept of informed consent, which has its roots in the principle of respect for autonomy. So this is thinking back to the major principles of bioethics, this is the principle that forms the anchor for informed consent. In the author's own words, the purpose of requiring informed consent is to promote autonomy to the individual in medical decision making. It is a way to, it's essentially a safeguard to make sure that when the person is being treated or undergoing some procedure, that they have in fact consented to the procedure in question, and that doing that procedure on them does not violate their autonomy in some way. Now, the authors advocate that we should understand informed consent not as a one-sided process, not as just a physician having to fulfill some kind of, formal legal requirement to get a signature on a form, but instead as a shared process of decision making, a sort of type of dialogue and conversational exchange between the physician and the patient. In fleshing out this conception of informed consent, they spend time addressing 8 myths about informed consent, and this is just the short list of all of those different myths. And you'll notice when you look at the article in its original text that every single myth has its own subsection, right? So the first myth is a signed consent form is informed consent, and then they've got a few paragraphs where they explain why that is a myth, why that is, in other words, an incorrect, but sometimes commonly held view of what informed consent is. And so they run through all 8 of these, try to show that all 8 of these views of informed consent are false, and then conclude their paper. So they start out by talking about what informed consent is in a broad sense, and then they kind of narrow their focus to each of these 8 individual issues, explain why none of these views of informed consent are right, and then wrap things up. So it's not a particularly complicated paper, and compared to some of the things we're going to read later on in the term, it's not super long. But because of its structure, it provides a really good opportunity to continue developing your skills on engaging with, identifying, and extracting arguments. So, how exactly do you go about doing that with text like this? Well, I've taken 3 passages out of the reading. One passage from the section myth 1, a signed consent form is informed consent. One from myth 7, patients must be given all information whether they want it or not. And one from myth 2, which is informed consent is a medical Miranda warning, and the one on 2 is a little bit more complicated than the others. So let's start with myth 1. How would you go about figuring out what the argument is in this paragraph? Now, before I go any further, I'll just say you may want to pause the video here, read this paragraph. I'm not going to read all this stuff out loud. You're fully capable, I'm sure, of reading it on your own. So perhaps pause the video here, take a couple seconds, or however long it takes, and read through this paragraph, and then I'll go through how you might approach the argument extraction process. Now, the first step in argument extraction is figuring out what the conclusion is. What is the thing that the authors are trying to establish in this particular paragraph? Now, we know from the section title that they consider this view to be a myth about informed consent. So in some way or another, the conclusion is either going to be that this view of informed consent is false, or it's going to be some kind of intermediary conclusion that's eventually going to be used to try to form that larger view. So let's look at the individual passages that we've got in here. First, they just state what the myth is, what people commonly believe. Now, it's important to recognize this is the presentation of an opposing viewpoint. So this is not going to be something that the authors ultimately support, but it is important to know what this is, because this is essentially what they're arguing against. Now, immediately following that presentation, we've got this sentence. Nothing could be further from the truth, as many courts have pointed out, physicians who are all too willing to believe this myth. Nothing could be further from the truth is basically a fancy way of saying this view, which is finally here. Informed consent has been obtained when a physician finds a consent form. Nothing could be further from the truth. These two ideas are connected. So this is a candidate, potentially, for concluding idea. Let's see what else they say in the paragraph. Consent forms are used as a matter of routine in both treatment and research settings because hospital administrators, physicians, and their attorneys see these forms as providing protection against liability, despite the fact that they actually provide little protection. So this paragraph, we do have, interestingly, a premise indicator here. So we do have, this would suggest that in this one sentence, we have this idea being expressed as a conclusion and this idea being expressed as a premise that supports this conclusion. Now, this is very common in complex philosophical articles. You will have potentially multiple conclusions in the same passage. The problem here, though, is if we're thinking about the main conclusion of the overall, like what the overall tenor of this is supposed to be, what the overall takeaway, it's better expressed actually right here in this idea. But in order to express that conclusion, we've got to do a little reconstruction, which I don't think you all have had to do yet in the context of this course. I think that the first exercise I gave you on this, you were basically just pulling things directly out of the text and weren't required to make any edits. But here we're going to probably have to do that a little bit. So the conclusion is sort of expressed in combination of these two passages. Let's give that a little highlighting. How about, sure, whatever. Yellow is too cliched. So here we have the two concluding ideas. So let's see how we could reconstruct to make those kind of coherent together. How about we just take the context of the first sentence. Oh, good Lord, if I can type correctly. Now that's close. I think we're going to add change the language a little bit. So let's express this idea as follows. Informed consent has not been obtained just because a patient signs a consent form. That seems to be a fair representation, bridging these two ideas together. Now, what about this sentence? As many courts have pointed out to physicians who are only too willing to believe this myth. This goes by kind of quickly, but this seems like, especially with the transitional as here, kind of like suggesting a link between these ideas, this is some kind of a premise that's supporting this idea some way or another. So let's just drop down and make a list. So one premise would seem to be now again, I'm doing some reconstruction here, right? So the actual passages, many courts have pointed out to physicians, as many courts have pointed out to physicians who are only too willing to believe this myth. Well, if we just extract that as it is, it's not even a complete sentence. It's not a coherent thought. So we've got to kind of rephrase it to capture the main idea. Many courts have pointed out that a signed consent form does not always mean that the patient has consented, right? It captures the same idea, but it's expressed more clearly than it was more clearly than it was in the original text. Now, what about this last part? Consent forms are used as a matter of routine in both treatment and research settings because many hospital administrators... This is going to sound odd, perhaps, given how much content there seems to be here. But essentially what the authors are doing is they're giving an explanation for why people believe this. Right? Why people might think that a signed consent form is informed consent. It's because these consent forms are used so often as a matter of routine, and people, and that's why these people start to see informed consent forms as just being a matter of protection against liability. So this is almost like a sort of separate idea from the actual main argument that's being put forward in this. So let's gray that out. It's there is an argument being presented here, right, in a sense, right, and it would have this first passage as a conclusion, but this is not the main conclusion of the passage. This is not the main idea that the authors are trying to get you to come away with. This is just a separate, independent explanation of why this myth persists in a lot of clinical settings. So be aware, this is why it's important, I think, to read, in this case, like, you'd want to read the entire section. This is just the first paragraph of the section. You'd want to read this entire section on myth 1 before you try to, kind of extract any arguments from it. But the other big thing here is you want to read the entire article as a whole before you start doing this kind of argument analysis, because you want to know what the author's overall position is so that you can differentiate when you're reading from these kinds of important big picture conclusions that you're supposed to reach and these smaller, more like narrowly focused conclusions on kind of independent or freestanding issues. If that sounds difficult, it's understandable. You get better at it as you do it more and more. By the end of this course, after you've read, a dozen or so articles, you'll be much better positioned to make these kinds of judgments than you are now. So if it seems difficult now, that's okay. You'll get better at it over time. Let's look at another passage. So this one is from the section on Myth 7. Patients must be given information whether they want it or not. Like with the previous one, take a minute to pause the video if you haven't already read this passage. Just pause it here, take a little time to read the passage and get a sense of it, and then I'll walk through this one same way. Now, the objectives and the rules of the extraction process haven't changed. The first thing we want to do is figure out what the main conclusion is. And if you go through this, and so again, we can use the section title as kind of a shortcut. We know they want to say that this view is false or something close to it. So when we scan this paragraph and we look down the sentences, there's one sentence that looks to clearly point toward this idea being false, and it's the second sentence in here. Withholding information from patients when they request that it not be given respects their autonomy as much as providing information to patients who want it. Now, is that the ultimate conclusion, or is that just a premise that's designed to support the kind of even broader conclusion that this claim is false? Since we're only looking at this one paragraph, it could be difficult to determine that, right? So again, you want to read the whole section and really the whole article before you start engaging in this kind of process. But for the purposes of just evaluating, since you only have this text, and given what else is here, my take is that this, at least with what we have, is the closest idea to expressing the conclusion in this paragraph. So let's just pull this out. It's pretty clearly expressed. I don't think we need to do any reconstruction with this. I will also point out here something that's worth noting, which is that it is often possible to reconstruct arguments that have very similar meaning in different ways, even looking at the same text. So I can imagine someone taking this paragraph and tweaking the argument so that the ultimate conclusion, instead of being this, is something like, let's mark this as an alternative, could be something like, going to add a conditional though to make this idea clearer. So now the reason that this reconstruction would be unusual is it's very rare to have a conditional statement, like an if-then statement, as a conclusion of an argument. Usually if-then statements will be premises. So this construction would be kind of unusual, but I can imagine somebody looking at this and thinking, well, the overall conclusion is supposed to be that if patients request not to be told certain information, then it doesn't violate informed consent to withhold that information from patients. I can at least imagine what that reconstruction would look like. Now, if you go this direction, I'm not going to sketch out all the premises for this, but I just say the premises would be a little bit different. You'd probably be using this idea as one of your main premises in that argument, and the overall structure would be a little bit different. So I'm just pointing out there's not always just one way to try to reconstruct an argument, and this is why in your own writing you often want to try to be as clear as possible as to what the major conclusion you're advocating is, and then build up your premises from there. Leave as little ambiguity to the reader as possible with respect to how they interpret you. Now, let's go back to this central conclusion. What are the premises here? Well, let's look at this first statement. Some patients choose not to participate in the decision-making process at all, or may wish to participate on a reduced basis. That, at least on my read, does not seem like a premise. It seems like that is just descriptive content. It's just a sort of, this is something patients do, right? Some patients will choose not to participate in the decision-making process. That doesn't clearly seem to me to be having an essential argumentative connection to this idea. The real reasoning that seems to support it comes in the next paragraph, which is enabling and permitting patients to make medical decisions is one way of fostering self-determination. Respecting their wish not to participate is another. So here, remember, the principal moral value is autonomy. Fostering self-determination has a clear connection to autonomy. Right? The whole idea behind autonomy is giving people the freedom to make their own choices. Self-determination is, like, again, basically the freedom to make your own choices and act on your own values without the interference of others. So this is clearly a premise that's contributing to this conclusion. What about the last sentence? Compelling patients to receive information that they do not want or to make decisions they do not make is to fail to respect their dignity. Dignity is also in some ways connected to autonomy, although the connection it takes a little bit longer to flesh out the connection, but the idea is that treating people in sort of paternalistic ways and not respecting their wishes is fundamentally a failure to respect them as people and respect their status as, adult human beings who can make rational decisions. So that is a separate idea that seems to be contributing to the same conclusion. So if we were to write this out again, come on, auto numbering, don't do that to me. Now, if we were, again, these passages seem like they're really pretty clearly expressed. I actually don't think we need to do any major reconstruction here. So notice how different, how much easier in some sense the reconstruction in this paragraph was compared to the previous one, right? In the previous one, we got to really, do some work to reconstruct a conclusion, and we've got to even rephrase like the main premise that's here because it's not expressed as a complete thought. Here, we're basically just copying and pasting the ideas right out. Now, like I said, if you went with this alternative interpretation of this paragraph, your how you structure it is probably going to be different. The way I think that this would work is you would have these two premises would be providing support for this conclusion. This conclusion would be a sub-conclusion, which means it would be functioning in the argument as both a premise and a conclusion, and then your ultimate conclusion would be this idea. That would be another way I think you could reconstruct this paragraph. I don't think that is... I think that if you're doing that, you're probably going a little bit beyond what's stated just in the text here, but you might be justified in doing that if you're looking at the Myth 7. There's several paragraphs, not just this one. There's several paragraphs in the Myth 7 section. So, like I said, I can imagine an argument that involves this kind of reconstruction. It's going to be a little bit more complicated, and it's probably not necessary if you were just given this one paragraph. I think that this would be equally good, if not better, way to represent the main conclusion of the passage. Now, let's look at the last one. This is basically the entire section on Myth 2, which is informed consent as a medical Miranda warning. So, again, definitely pause the video here. Take some time to read these paragraphs and get a sense of what's going on. And then, once again, we'll go through and try to figure out what's going on and how we can extract the argument. Okay. Once again, first objective. What's the main conclusion? Well, like the other passages, we know that they think this view is a myth, which means that they think this is false. So let's look to see if there's anything in here that expresses that idea. If there's nothing that expresses that idea, in the text itself, we may have to do some reconstruction. The first thing, though, to notice as we work through this, there's a lot of information here in this first paragraph that doesn't seem to be contributing to the argument. It's just kind of an explanation of what a Miranda warning is. So, informed consent is often no more than a medical Miranda warning. Let's leave that untouched for now, but let's look at this next part. Just as police are required, blah, blah, blah. Some physicians believe informed consent has been obtained if they weren't of the patient treatment. This is just an explanation of what a Miranda warning is and what some physicians believe about it. This isn't contributing one way or another to the overall argument. It's just clarification for the reader so they understand what a Miranda warning is and how it functions. Now, certainly patients should be told about some risks of treatment. Now, this is tough. I'm going to come back to this paragraph in a moment. Let's look at the last one first. Knowledge of one's options alone, however, is not meaningful unless one also knows the range of consequences. Oh, that's a typo. That's not even... I copied this straight out of the article, so something must have been lost in conversion. We shall fix the typo first, because that's important to understand. So, knowledge of one's options alone, however, is not meaningful unless one knows the range of consequences in choosing each option. One facet of information about the consequences is the risk of treatment. There are others, such as information about likely outcomes, including information about mortality, morbidity, and functioning. So this is the first thing that I've looked at so far that clearly has significant argumentative content. They're trying to show that just disclosing risks of treatment is not sufficient to get informed consent from patients. There's more to the story. So that's obviously connected to this idea. So let's tentatively mark this as a premise. Seems like this has some kind of premise content, right? And it seems like these two ideas, well, at least this one, need to know the range of consequences in choosing each option. One facet of information is risk of treatment, which they've already established. Now, this is where we got to do some, there's some wiggle room here for interpretation. This, to me, is just clarification of what this first statement means. So, I don't think you necessarily have to mark this as an independent premise. But some people might say that you can't make sense of this first statement without the second. They might say you need to combine these two ideas to really understand what the premise involved is, right? I'm more of a fan of constructing arguments minimally, at least at a first gloss. So I'm going to leave this unmarked. Just know, though, that it's got a clear connection to this idea. It clearly fleshes out what's meant in this statement. Because basically this last statement is they're explaining what they mean by range of consequences in choosing each option, right? So you could, if you wanted, mark this last part of the sentence, and then when you reconstructed your premise, combine these two into one idea that would be a little bit, more substantive. I don't think that's necessary, but it's something that you could do if you wanted your argument reconstruction to have slightly more precision. So let's come back to this kind of complicated second paragraph. So we've got two ingredients here. We've got the authors are saying patients should be told about the risks of treatment, but knowledge of one's options alone is not meaningful unless one knows the range of consequences in choosing each option. Admittedly, it's difficult to know what risks are being disclosed. This is just clarification about what they mean when they say, being told about risks of treatment. I don't think that this has any premise or conclusion content. Mark that gray like the other stuff. Rather than focusing on the risks, focus needs to be on therapeutic options. For example, blah, blah, blah. So anytime that you see, for example, almost always, that is going to be some kind of a clarification of a premise that was presented earlier. It's not universal, but a lot of times these are just clarificatory remarks that don't themselves have premise content. So here, the premise content is this. Well, it's actually not even that. It's really just this idea. Although, wait, what did I just, why did I did not mean to do that. Let's, that's why they invented Control-Z. But it occurs to me that to make the connection between these two ideas, you kind of do need that rather than focusing on the risks. So let's just, no, that's what it just did. There we go. No. Oh, why does everything have to be so complicated? There we go. So, first premise that seem to have in this paragraph, patients should be told about the risks of treatment. Rather than focusing on the risks, though, the focus needs to be on therapeutic options. And there's an explanation here what's an example of that. It looks like the next sentence is the same thing. Patients with breast cancer, that's another example, need to know different kinds of combinations of surgery. All patients need to know that one of their options is to do nothing. That seems like a new idea to me, right? All patients need to know that one of their options is to do nothing. Well, that's not really a therapeutic option, is it? I mean, it is an option for treatment, namely no treatment, but it seems like it's something different. It's not like you're going in for a procedure or something, or subjecting yourself to a treatment. So now, notice, we've gone through every single sentence in here, and we've got a bunch of premise content, but there's nowhere in here where there's actually been like a concrete statement of the conclusion. So here I think we've got to just be a little bit creative, and we have to think about how do we take this title, because this, I want to stress again, this is the entire section on Myth 2 in the text. I didn't take anything out. The other ones, I extracted just a little bit of information. This one I didn't. This is the whole section on Myth number 2. So the only real clue we have here to the conclusion of this passage, of these series of passages, is the overall section title. We know that the authors think informed consent is a medical Miranda warning. They think that view is false because they've labeled it as a myth. So let's take a crack at just representing that idea as a complete sentence. So let's just go with for now. Now, the other thing to point out here is you can always tweak your premises and conclusions as you reconstruct. If you think, it's not like once you write this down, it's written there forever and can never be changed. You can always tweak it if you think that it's not specific enough or that it's going in the wrong direction. So let's start with that, though. Informed consent's not just a medical Miranda warning. Now let's look at some of the pieces that we have. We have this information here, justice, police, blah, blah, blah. Some physicians believe that informed consent has been obtained if they warn patients of the risk of treatment. Now, I marked this earlier as just being an explanation of what a Miranda warning is. But now we're in a different position than when we started reading this, right? Because we've gone through the whole thing and we haven't really found, we haven't found information that ties these premises to this kind of conclusion, and we also didn't find a clear statement of the conclusion. So what we need to do here is we need to start thinking about this last idea. Maybe this is actually a premise of some sort because it contains a connection, right? It contains information that ties the risk of treatment to the concept of a Miranda warning. Now, the question, of course, is how do we get this idea to kind of set the groundwork for getting us to the conclusion that we've written down here? Well, again, we got to do some reconstruction, kind of be creative. So this is a representation of what a Miranda warning, means in a medical context, right? Some physicians believe, according to this concept of informed consent as a medical Miranda warning, that informed consent has been obtained if they warn patients about the risks of treatment. Well, let's reconstruct that as a conditional statement and see what we can do with it. Let's see, how did they put it? Now again, this isn't set in stone. We could tweak it if we want, but for now, let's go with that. So I've reconstructed this paragraph, mainly focusing on this last sentence, as if informed consent is understood as a medical Miranda warning, then informed consent has been obtained when patients are informed of the risks of treatment. So that's trying to capture this idea. Now, we've got a bunch of premise content in this second paragraph The authors concede that patients should be told about the risks of treatment. Now this is, again, kind of tricky. How do we take I can imagine several ways to do this. The basic question is, how do we take this information that's left that we've identified as premise content in some way or another and reconstruct it consistent with this idea to get us to this conclusion? It's kind of, it's kind of like solving a puzzle. We've got some of the pieces. We need to figure out what the others are, and hopefully when we put them together, we get, kind of a logically consistent line of reasoning that links all these premises together to ultimately get us to this conclusion. The key observation here is that it's not just focusing on the risk, right? It's not just that patients be told about the risks of treatment, right? That's the ultimate goal. So I think the second premise is going to be, if we combine all this information together, it's going to be something like this. Now, that seems kind of minimal, right? Considering all the information we have up here, that seems like it contains premise content. Here's how I think, if you were going to reconstruct this fully, here's how I think the argument, what you'd wind up doing. You would reconstruct some of these ideas as premises in a sub-argument that has this idea as its conclusion. Let me show you what I mean for like how that would work. Let's use a different label here. A sub-argument is totally a word. Just cooperate with me on this. Come on. Yeah, we'll use parentheses, sure. So here's how I think that this would go if you wanted to flesh out the sub-argument that supports this second premise. You would have I notice that I need to specify that we're in a context involving informed consent in the premises. So how do we do that across all of these? All right, and finally, we got to get this idea, right? Knowledge of one's options is not meaningful unless one also knows the range of consequences in choosing each option. No, we don't need a transition order. And then just to make it all consistent, let's just represent our second premise using the exact same language. Has the same meaning, but now the language is tighter. So here we would have in this little sub-argument, we've got these three premises leading to this conclusion. We're then taking this conclusion and we're using it as a premise in this bigger, like larger scale argument, which is what the whole section is about, right? So we're saying in the second premise that you got to do more than just inform patients of the risk of treatment. Because you have to inform patients of more than just the risk of treatment, we know that informing them of the risk of treatment doesn't mean that informed consent has been obtained. That entails that informed consent should not be understood as a medical Miranda warning. And so we should probably, again, tighten up the language a little bit. Keep it consistent among everything we've written. Man, that was a lot of work. So I don't think that any of the passages that you're doing on your homework are this convoluted and require this much reconstruction, but some of them may require a little bit of reconstruction. You may have to kind of exercise your creative logical thinking to try to make sense of all of it. There is, by the way, this would go above and beyond the call of duty. You could, if you wanted, you could reconstruct all of this as a single argument. Let me just take these ingredients and I'll just, we've gone this far. Let me show you what that would look like if you wanted to. If you wanted to do it all as a regimented single argument, this is what it would ultimately look like. Okay, so let's see. How do we need to label some of the steps here. Okay, these are all the pieces, so here's how this fits together. We started with same place, our original conditional statement, right, that we inferred from the first paragraph and all of that. We've got if informed consent is understood as a medical Miranda warning, then informed consent has been obtained when patients are informed of the risks of treatment. We also have our original premise too, thus obtaining informed consent from patients requires more than just informing the patients of the risk of treatment, and that's designed to generate our ultimate conclusion. So we have statements 1 and 5 that are getting us to that. And then we've got 2 through 4 here that are all designed to support this claim. So what we've got here is we've got premises, let's get correct ones highlighted. We've got premises 2, 3, and 4 that are all supporting this observation, that obtaining informed consent from patients requires more than just informing the patients of the risk of treatment. We're then taking that conclusion and we're combining it with this initial statement to generate our overall conclusion of the argument. So this statement here, this is what we mean when we call something a sub-conclusion. I don't know if I've put that in anywhere previously, but a sub-conclusion in one context functions as a conclusion, right? Because it's a conclusion. These 4 claims represent one argument contained within a larger argument. So it functions in that context as a conclusion, but in the overall structure of the entire argument, it's actually just a premise, right? It's a premise that's being used to get you to your ultimate endpoint. So it is functioning both as a premise and an intermediary conclusion in this overall argument. So I don't know how often we'll see this, a sub-conclusion construction in the course, but like a lot of the arguments we'll look at will be pretty simple. But you might see it again. When we get to some of the more complex readings toward the end of the term, we might see something like this again. So this would be an alternative way you could reconstruct it. The template I was using for how we were reconstructing these arguments, I did it, a little bit of a different way. Anyway, I think that about covers it. I hope that this gives you enough kind of insight into how this process is supposed to work. Like I said, I don't think that any of the passages you're engaging with are as complicated in terms of reconstruction as this one was. That was actually kind of why I pulled it out to do it. I want to give you an idea of what something more advanced looks like. But they are going to be a little bit more complicated than these other two that we looked at, which didn't have a ton of content in them at all and required relatively minimal reconstruction. So I hope this gives you some insight into both the reasoning that Meisel and Kuczewski are using, but also just general how to actually extract arguments from complex passages. Because this is a skill that you're going to need as we move along in the course if you're going to continue to make sense of the reading material that we're engaging with. So with that in mind, good luck on the assignment. I'll see you next time.